One of the parts of this Donald Trump administration that is going to fascinate me the most is the Elon Musk, Vivek Ramaswamy Doge, as it's being called. I don't know if it's a branch or, movement that they've started that is called the Department of Government Efficiency. And what they're going to do is basically take a sledgehammer to the bureaucracy and figure out how to save you, the taxpayer, us, the taxpayers, tremendous amounts of money and start digging away at this $36 trillion in debt. There's been this assumption, and I've been part of this, saying, well, we've got to do something about Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. It is a growing part of the budget. It's unsustainable. But as E.J. Antoni writes here, he's an economist with The Heritage. He's on X at Real E.J. Antoni. He writes that entitlements aren't the problem yet, and Doge will prove it. EJ, good morning. Great to have you on KCMO. So how can this Department of Government Efficiency, being headed by Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, start to chip away at this $36 trillion in debt? What does it look like?
Well, thank you for having me. Essentially, what it looks like is going through the budget, combing through it line by line, which is a big budget, trillions of dollars worth, and finding all the boondoggles, finding the waste, the fraud, the abuse, and cutting out all the fat. And if you don't think that there's a lot, you consider the fact that all of the excess spending that we have thrown into the budget over the last several years has created literally the entirety of the deficit. In other words, imagine the Biden administration comes into office and they do absolutely nothing. They don't add any new spending. Believe it or not, the budget balances today.
Is that right? So
yes, it is.
So the budget balances today if they just came in and kept spending at what, pre-COVID levels?
Exactly. So you come into office, simply allow the one-time emergency COVID spending that was already in place to just expire. In other words, money that was allocated in 2020, right? And that spending is going to expire because it's a one-time measure. Let it expire and then simply go back to the previous levels of spending. Let the economy heal naturally. And although that spending doesn't quite total up to the deficit, you have to remember that all of that extra spending also added trillions of dollars to the national debt, which is now paying about 3, 4, 5% interest, depending on which segment of the debt you're talking about. So you not only have the additional spending, right, but now you have the interest on the debt that you are paying, which has gone up. So in other words, you put all of that together, and yes, you get a balanced budget if you can rewind the clock and remove it all.
That's amazing. Okay, so what about, and I don't know if this is something, I didn't see this in this piece of yours on X, but I know that there's been data that's come out the last couple of weeks showing that I think it's like 10% of certain government bureaucracy workers are back in the office, and there's many of them who double dip in the private sector and the public sector, which tells me that there's probably a lot of those public sector jobs, those government jobs that can be eliminated. What does that look like? Have you guys crunched any numbers on that front on what this Doge can potentially look at and do when it comes to just pure number of workers and pensions and insurance costs and all the money that can be saved on that front?
Well, you're absolutely right that we have literally millions of federal workers who don't even show up into the office anymore. And it was already legendary how terrible their productivity was when they were in the office. And now it's gone down even more now that they don't even show up to work. And actually, it's interesting. Some estimates indicate that probably half of the desired reduction in the federal workforce could happen if you simply require that these folks show up every day. Think of that. These people are, they literally will just simply quit if you require that they go into the office. And we also have to remember that the cost savings here, one of the reasons why they're so big is not only do these government workers make much more than their private sector counterparts, but their benefit packages are worth about 80% more than their private sector counterparts. And so it's not just simply a matter of the salary savings, but also you mentioned things like retirement accounts and insurance. The cost savings there would also be tremendous.
So if this is to come to fruition, I mean, you're going to have Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy head this thing, but then they're going to present a recommendation to Congress, right? And that's where Congress actually has to have the backbone to make all these reductions. Is that the process here? And if so, how likely do you think it is that Congress will do what needs to be done?
Well, there are certain things that you're definitely going to need Congress to eliminate. However, there is a lot of spending that Congress has essentially authorized. So, in other words, this department or whatever has money, has however much money they need for their payroll, right? Well, guess what? If you can eliminate the payroll, then you don't actually need Congress to okay a reduction in spending. And I think this is one of the key areas where DOGE can really, really help the nation, is the fact that they can identify for the president which bureaucrats need to be fired. And let's not forget that essentially the entire executive branch more or less serves at the pleasure of the president. Now, there are certain rules and regulations in place that make it more difficult for the president to fire some people, and that's why we need things like Schedule F reform. But essentially what DOGE can do is tell the president, look, this entire wing of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, this entire wing of the VA, this entire wing of the Bureau of Economic Analysis, all these people are essentially doing no work. Fire them all.
Wow. And on top of that, think about what it would do to help economic growth in the private sector, right? I mean, these people are going to have to work somewhere. So you would actually have this downstream effect where you would help the private sector, which has been struggling to get people to work because of all the things the government's doing to make it difficult for them. But also the government's been hiring more people than the private sector many of these months the last 4 years, right? So you could actually have a boost to the private sector by doing this as well.
Exactly. That's 100% right. And what we saw in, I believe it was the month of September, the number of people reporting to the Bureau of Labor Statistics that they were working for the government, the number of people reporting that in the surveys jumped by almost 800,000 in a single month. So you're absolutely right. These are all people that could be working for the private sector, could be contributing to society, could be contributing to productivity, and instead they're doing exactly the opposite. Many of them aren't even working at all, and yet they're getting paid more than if they were in the private sector. I mean, it's an absolute sin.
E.J. Antoni is here, economist with Heritage. Let me ask you, too, I know a lot of us will say, well, the military budget, don't want to touch that, can't touch that. But like any government bureaucracy, I'm sure there's plenty of fat there as well. So how do you see and how should the administration handle whatever fat exists within the United States military budget?
Oh, my goodness. I can't stand these politicians, most of whom are Republicans, who keep talking about how the military budget is sacrosanct and we can't cut defense spending. We need to increase defense spending. No, we don't. How many stories do we need about the Pentagon paying $10,000 for a screwdriver or a hammer? How many of those stories do we need before we say, oh, wow, maybe we should actually have an audit? By the way, the Pentagon has literally never passed a single audit in its entire history. Think of that. But how many of these stories do we need before we realize we need to rein in all of the waste, fraud, and abuse in defense as well as these other programs? It's not just discretionary spending broadly. It is defense spending specifically that, again, has tremendous amounts of waste, fraud, and abuse. So we do need to cut the defense budget because we need to cut all of this garbage out.
Now, what about entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid? I mean, they are a growing percentage of the budget. What does it look like when it comes to having to reevaluate those programs, if nothing else, to keep them solvent for decades to come?
Well, we have to remember that these programs are and were essentially set up as Ponzi schemes. What I mean by that is you need certain demographic things to keep happening. So in a Ponzi scheme, you need to constantly find new and new investors to pay off your old investors because you don't actually have any kind of investments that are generating revenue. That's why guys like Bernie Madoff were able to do what they did. They constantly found new millionaires and billionaires to dump money into a fund that wasn't actually seeing any kind of return on investment. These government programs, these entitlement programs, were essentially set up the exact same way. So I say all that to point out that, look, eventually you do need to sunset these programs. They can't go on forever because the math just isn't there. It is a Ponzi scheme. For right now, though, you do not need to cut anybody's Social Security benefits. You simply don't. There is enough revenue coming into the system. There are enough people working today to pay for today's beneficiaries. So this idea that somehow that is what's blowing up the budget, again, the numbers just aren't there. That's not true. Eventually, are you going to need to tell 20 and 30-year-olds, look, Social Security is not going to be there when you hit 65, 70. Sorry. Yes, eventually that's going to happen, but we're not there today. And again, that is not the primary driver of the budget deficit.
EJ Antoni, economist with Heritage. Find him on X at Real EJ Antoni. I hope that the Elon Musk, Vivek Ramaswamy duo listens to you and your team and takes some advice, because, man, do we need it, EJ. Thank you so much for the time. I appreciate it.
No, thank you for having me.
Well done. Excellent work by EJ Antoni on KCMO Talk Radio 95.7 FM. Stream us if you're working from home on the KCMO Talk Radio app, the Alexa or the Google. Just tell it, hey, Google, hey, Alexa, play KCMO Talk Radio.